Right. So we will start. Thank you, Mark and Nina, for having us, for organizing these 2 days, inviting us to contribute to them too, and we're very pleased to have this Friday as a sort of space and moment for conversations, because tomorrow there's a lot going on, and we thought it would be good to have some moments of some more reflective moments. No need to introduce Nina. We all know Nina by now. We also have here Christian Molenaar, who's a multidisciplinary artist from San Diego, California, came all the way from California. His extensive body of work has incorporated film, painting, and music. His work often includes hand-built electronics and instruments to explore the relationship between the personal and the sacred. We'll be showing your film a little later in a moment. We also welcome Harri Hudspith, who's an artist and researcher with a practice that looks at how pre-modern women, the woman mystic's writing speaks to our idea of knowledge, language, gender, and the body. Tomorrow you will be here with your partner Laura Dora, and as a collaborator in Sacra, and you'll be performing here tomorrow. So thank you for coming. And I'm a researcher. I completed my PhD here 2 years ago, and this is the third time I'm working with Mark and Nina in this religion and art sort of research project. And I really hope we're going to be able to sort of explore ideas and not worry too much about being recorded and be a bit clumsy, and try to sort of push our boundaries. So to start, I'd really, because we all sort of seem to share a love for the mystics, I'd like to hear first about you, about your own relation to the mystic. You've worked on, for this film that we're going to be showing today and tomorrow, on Hadovich of Antwerp or Brabant. She could be
now Antwerp, but originally from
Brabant. Yes, and if you can tell us a bit about how you came to your encounter with the mystics, and in particular with her, and how she's influenced your work.
Sure. I am really happy to be here. First off, I'm not remotely an academic. I'm a true amateur in the original sense. I came to the mystics originally as a musician. I'm a fan of Baroque and pre-Baroque early music, so I came to Hildegard originally. She was sort of my window into that world, and from there I started looking into some of the other early mystics and eventually came upon Hadovich, who was a Dutch or Flemish Beguine. She experienced a series of visions which she recorded in poems. She wrote poems in stanzas, which are sort of the inspiration for the film I made, and she also wrote poems in couplets. She experienced a very personal relationship with God, where in her visions she would ascend to the throne of heaven and have her soul be wed to Jesus, and then eventually be cast back, kind of crashing down to earth. She wrote over and over about how much pain she was in every time she'd be returned to earth. She writes a lot about joy and love, but often in terms of pain and suffering, which I think is sort of a very Catholic worldview. And that was sort of the inspiration for the film that I made, which is sort of about bodily experience of religion and spirituality, sort of the ways that we feel love and the ways that love is felt through us. Not always in maybe the most positive sense. That was something I wanted to explore. It was a project I wanted to make for a long time, trying to set some of her poems to music, which is part of what's in the score for the film, and trying to find my own relationship with her poetry and with her experience.
And you use the original language the Middle
Yes,
Dutch?
they're all in Middle Dutch, which thankfully it's subtitled, so you guys don't have to worry about that part.
Harri, you've been captivated by Teresa of Avila. Can you tell us a bit about how it all started, how you came across her and your relationships with her since?
Yeah, so I sort of slipped and fell down. I'm an artist, and I've been an artist for quite a while, and started off thinking I was going to be a sculptor, and got really into Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculpture of Teresa in Ecstasy, and sort of ended up realizing that she's far more interesting than he was, at least for me, and she spoke a lot more to me about the relationship between words and images and meaning and sort of interior psychological experience, and I just got really hooked on all of the imagery she uses in her writing, which started off the sort of obsession I have with her and the way she uses images to sort of convey meaning and to talk about her relationship with language and reading, and I just sort of got more and more obsessed. And did my PhD on her, where I spent most of the time effectively trying to think about how does her devotional practice, her mystical practice of recogimiento or recollection, which is this kind of prayer, meditation, reading combo, how that resonates with my practice, with my arts practice. So how does her understanding of language and of words and the way she reads text in a really fun, weird way, how does that reflect my own understanding of what happens when I read a text? And can I read her in the same way she read about Christ? And can I develop a sort of parallel relationship with her in the same way she developed a relationship with Christ? And can I get closer and closer to her in the same way she got closer and closer to Christ and then to God? And the answer is kind of yes, but not in quite the same way, but that was never the intention. And so, yes, it's very much become for me about thinking about mysticism, her mysticism and other women's mysticisms as a kind of creative practice. And what do they feel like for someone who has a creative practice?
Which is your favorite text by Teresa? Would you prefer reading her texts, her letters and teachings to the nuns, or her correspondence, or which of the texts that?
Okay, so my favorite are probably her autobiography, her The Way of Perfection, her meditations on the Song of Songs I'm very obsessed with, but The Interior Castle is the first one I sort of slipped and fell into, and the whole structure and the proximity between the way she talks about basically the soul as a castle structured in 7 realms, but the text is also the castle, and the text is structured in these same 7 realms. And so when she's writing it, she's talking about her own experience of moving through the castle, moving through herself towards God. And then as you're reading it, you're also moving through it with her, sort of like a voyeur, like a little peeping Tom watching her all the way along, but she knows you're there. She wants you. The whole point of the text is to bring you along with her. And that proximity between the text, the image of the castle, her own soul, and then your own soul, and all of these things that are happening all at once, at least in my mind. That was the bit that hooked me in, I think, the first time.
We'll pick up on that sort of idea of voyeurism, because all these mystics, they were writing either for themselves or for their confessors or for their nuns or in their correspondence, and all those very intimate texts that were never really meant for publishing. Most of them, I mean, we're not going to generalize, all the mystics are slightly different, but you're really entering into something very deep and intimate, that is that moment of union with the divine. So we'll come back to that, but just to stick for a while with Teresa of Avila, Nina's also had a passion and a love for Teresa that, well, I know about the 1992 film, Now I'm Yours, but maybe it started earlier. If you can also share with us your encounter with her and your relationship with her.
Yes, I suppose I came to Teresa through two routes. One was that I was sort of thinking, I really came to her through Lacan, you know, Lacan's essay on jouissance, encore, you know, and the issue of phallic jouissance and mystical jouissance, which he divides in that essay. And in that essay, in the publication of that essay, that's gone off. There is an image of Bernini's in the book in which it is published, the one edition that I had, which was Juliet Mitchell's. I can't remember her. I think it's Juliet Mitchell and well, they use an image of the Bernini statue in that book, and as a cover, you know, it's kind of split. Anyway, so I was just interested in Lacan's idea of jouissance, which is something I'm still interested in, as a kind of as a sort of something that drives work in some way. And so I'd also maybe I might have mentioned it or something to my mother, because she then sent me at the same time something she got off air, which is the 1960s something film of Teresa, Spanish television, and she sent it to me as well, and I use a clip of that in my film. But so anyway, so from that I just began to think about, I was also very interested in psychoanalysis as a route to the subject, and of course, you know, the mystic in a sense, her writing is very much a very intense kind of internal look at herself and how, so I was thinking about psychoanalysis as a way of mapping myself further, and Teresa became a kind of a sort of a space. And I believed in Teresa at that time as a writer, not really as a mystic. My interest in her was in her writing, especially her autobiographical writing. So, and then after that, I went to her other mystical texts, you know, her texts, her theological writings, and so forth. So really, I was thinking about Teresa as a sort of space of a sort of very intense psychoanalytic sort of, you know, space in some way, you know, where you are looking at how you're looking at your own state. You know, sort of experiencing a state and looking at it at the same time as a mystic. You're sort of commenting on it, but you're also experiencing it. And the idea of turmoil was also very interesting to me, you know, because the mystical state to me did not necessarily represent peace and meditation. It represented turmoil. And I was interested in it from that perspective, you know, the perspective of not disruption, but something turbulent and turmoil that is obviously in the Bernini statue, represented in the Bernini statue, but also in her writings as well. So as far as the Bernini statue goes, which I did film it, you know, I was thinking about representation, and at that time, the difference between the representation in the stone, which is of course, Bernini and male, and Teresa's own accounts of herself, and the written and the visual. And so those for me were the sort of axes through which I kind of was operating. And then, of course, I then imprinted myself through my own voice onto these images, and I added my own, and I kind of tried through the film to kind of inscribe myself, to develop a sense of inscription, self-inscription into these materials.
How do we, I think that's something that we can discuss too, is like, how do we relate to these women? I mean, I also had an obsessive relationship with a mystic that happened at the end of my sort of research that was not on mysticism or on the religious, but on performance art. And I came across the work of Simone Weil, and who, some would consider a mystic, a Christian mystic, others agnostic. I mean, she's not easy to pin down, but I became completely obsessed and haunted. Haunted, that's another word. Haunted might have sort of a sort of heavier weight, but obsessed with her, sort of in not in love, but yes, feeling a great compassion for her, an attraction for her writing, and feeling very sorry for her life. And so she came into my research into a more sort of a scholarly, so suddenly the affective was brought into the academic sort of research. So there's, my last chapter ended up being sort of trying to stay sort of very academic in theory, but also there was this sort of a very emotional aspect to it. And I didn't know quite well what to do. I was sort of there was also another artist I was working on at the moment, and I also sort of built a strong sort of affective relationship with her work at the same time, and Simone Weil sort of appeared in the work too, and just thinking of how to approach those texts of those women who had disappeared or wanted to disappear and were stubbornly trying to disappear, how to bring, how to relate to those women who just didn't want to relate maybe with me. But I tried to think of ways of how to approach them, and I use the sort of the metaphor, the image of pebbles in the mouth, of how to keep those two women at the time, the artist I was working on, and Simone Weil as pebbles in my mouth that I was not quite ready to consume, but that I wanted sort of to keep there. And so I was sort of imagining sort of the licking of the tongue and the tasting of the of their words and of their lives, sort of remaining in there for a while and not quite consuming them, absorbing them, or taking them. That obviously takes me to Simone Weil's sort of understanding of love and desire, as the risk in love and desiring can actually destroy the object of desire, right? Simone Weil has an image of the soul similar. I mean, I think she did read Teresa Avila and probably The Interior Castle, but she uses the image of the labyrinth, in which the soul comes and sort of and journeys sort of to find God, and in the middle of the labyrinth, God eats you up. Sort of that union is a destructive sort of union. So, no, it's all right. I think that sort of before we carry on this idea of how to relate to these women or their writing, and at the risk of objectifying them, of consuming them, of appropriation, but and other ways of approaching them that might be, more in sort of in sisterhood or in care. Before we approach that again, I think it's a moment to watch your film, if that's all right, and if Rob is around, if we can watch Christian's film, and then we can carry on with the discussion. Is that all right?
Het was in ene 13 dagen. Toen was ik 19 jaar oud. Toen had ik willen te onze Heren te gaan. Ende ik was, te dien tijde, in begeerten. En de in oversterken eisenen, wie God neemt en de geeft, die in verlorenheden van hem, in opnemene van gebruikenessen, hem als in allen nazienen willen zien. En de doe werd ik opgenomen in een geester en de gevoerd daar wie waard getoond, een hoge, geweldige stad. ende een engelkwaan met een gloeiende wierookvaten en de gloeiende van vierige roken. En de knielde voor het hoogste stad der zetelen, daar die kronen boven hield. En die deden hem ere mede. En ik werd met die wederbracht jammerlijke in mijzelven.
Thank you guys for watching that, for coming out today. That was a film that I had in mind for a long time. I wanted to make it for a while, but had very few opportunities to make a strange sort of experimental film about 13th century mystics. There's not a built-in audience for that. So I was really happy when this opportunity came around, sort of to Mark's questions earlier of if not for me and also if not now. This kind of seemed like the perfect opportunity to take something that I had sort of privately hoped to do and be able to, bring to life and have a concrete result, sort of to what we were talking about before we played it, about sort of the theme of voyeurism in these mystic relations between themselves and any sort of higher power. Film, obviously, is kind of a voyeuristic medium in general. It's all about watching. Particularly, maybe it's just because I'm in England, I've been thinking about Julian of Norwich lately, and specifically how she tries to minimize herself in her writing, which is sort of interesting since she is, her book is really the first one we have in English by a woman, and is notable enough just for that, but also in her own life tried to fade even further into the background by becoming an anchoress and having almost no contact with anyone else, and just trying to live through her words and through her recorded relationship. It's interesting that we come in as sort of this outside presence trying to learn something from her, whether or not we do. I find that kind of relationship really interesting, and it's something we also find in Hadovich because we know almost nothing about her. She has basically no biography. She lived on this Beguine sort of almost like a colony until they basically threw her out. She was there to live among other women who were devoting themselves to their faith, and then she began having these visions, and they said that was a little too much. So they sort of, Julian, who I mentioned a second ago, is someone who foregrounds that relationship, and it's something I was interested in this film. That all the way back to Aristotle, there's this kind of history within philosophy and thinking of a creator as having separate equivocal realms of a creator and created. And I think going all the way back to Pseudo-Dionysus and John Scotus Eriugena, these are thinkers who brought up that when you look at the relationship between A and B as they're related, like if you look at God versus creation, by foregrounding that relationship, you run the risk of putting that on a pedestal and making that the higher power. And I think for a lot of these mystics, they were some of the first thinkers to foreground that as a power in itself. I find that idea of relating as sort of a univocality, it's something that Spinoza later brought up, and then Deleuze really foregrounds it as immanence. But I think these early mystics sort of bring up an early paradigm of immanence that is sort of neglected, at least in the philosophical tradition, I think because they're working specifically in religion.
I mean, there's an interesting moment that the time of, I don't know, it's a bit before Hadovich, but it revolutionized the understanding of theology and our understanding of God, which was Bernard de Clairvaux, obviously the mystic, the Cistercian mystic that was going back to the Song of Songs and to a much more effective and emotional relation to Jesus' humanity. That was quite different to what they'd been used to, more scholastic sort of theology. So that's the trend and the difference between the mystical theology and theology that is more scholastic or more theory-based. And so they brought sort of that relational aspect to God. And and that sort of bridal relation to God, really in their own, they embodied it very much. So the relation, as I mentioned before the film, to think of how we can relate to them and go into the, I think the word appropriation is really not appropriate, because in a way appropriation sort of assumes a property or an object that is sort of that's taken over. But in a way, Teresa of Avila or Hadovich and even Simone Weil, they didn't understand their selves or their writing as, or even their body as theirs. They were giving themselves up constantly in that union with God, because they were becoming sort of that object of union as well as that subject of union. And also in their writings, they were not writing because they were writing for others all the time. And I think that just the fact of, when you realize what they did with the body of Teresa of Avila as soon as she was dead, I mean, she clearly did not understand herself as her own. So can you appropriate that which is not even property itself? So I don't think it's a word that I would use in my relation to Teresa or to Simone Weil. I don't know what you think, Harri, about that. I mean, just to say that the body of Teresa of Avila was cut out into several pieces and was given away, and her writing, same thing happened with her writing. So her friend Gracian, Geronimo Gracian, published all her writing very quickly, edited it, in a sense not appropriate. I don't know if you would call it appropriation, but there was no notion. It was just not hers, and she was not herself, her own self in that way. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm always horrified and fascinated by the fact, I think it's Gracian steals her, when they chop her up after she's dead, he takes her little finger as like a keepsake to run away with, which is wonderful and horrible. And they redug her up, I think 5 years ago, and
yes, she was
re-examined her. So she's still not her own. She's still not herself, never was herself. And she's probably fine with that, I think. But I think that sense of, that's one of the things that for me, in thinking about appropriation, I think you're completely right, I do all sorts of things with Teresa that I'm pretty sure she wouldn't be happy with. And I don't think we'd like each other if we met in real life, or we'd agree with each other in any way, shape, or form. But the very nature of the writings of herself that she leaves behind for us had that intention at their core. They're not a record of her experience. They're not a sort of neutral account. They're a pedagogical tool that is intended for the reader to make the reader go and do their own interior journey. So she's giving it all away anyway to be used and taken in that sort of appropriative cycle, if you want to call it that way, or imitative cycle. So it's all fair game in my mind.
She does say at the beginning of the Interior Castle, she says, this should be used for those, I think she does mention it might have to be used only by the nuns, and I think, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing he is, or she is, or they were, quite strict on this can be read only by those who want to do this journey. So there is sort of obviously a care, you have to be careful and humble as we approach them, but there's something quite beautiful in the fact that we can relate to them in some way.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about on that point of that she was not herself, that she was not her own, in possession of her own self, I think you said, or something akin to that. I mean, one of the ways that I entered Teresa in the film Now I'm Yours, 1992, was through her as a writer, and there was beginning to be some scholarship on her, some literary kind of writing on her, as a very as a figure of literature. rather than as a figure of religion or as a mystic, as a theologian. And what was really interesting about this particular kind of analysis of her work was how her rhetoric, how she used specific rhetoric in her writing in order to avoid being pinned down as a woman, because, she runs some risks in writing already through the biography, the autobiography, and already through the quasi-theological texts, that she was writing. So she was very aware, in a way, she was extremely hyper-aware of herself as a writer and as a woman writer. And in order to do that, in order to kind of conceal that awareness, Julian Smith, he was extremely good, the Hispanic body, around the rhetoric of herself as a small woman, as a very unimportant person writing. So she's writing within the margins of her own self. And so she takes great care that her writing is not read as self-important or as making any kind of claims. And so she always declares herself to be a humble woman and a modest woman who doesn't know anything. That's one of the rhetorics. There are many others. So she uses tropes of self-diminishment, which leads, certain kind of analyses to conclude that she was extremely hyper-aware of herself and of her own use of language in her own writing. So contrary to the idea that this flowed out of her, especially the life, that it was not, it was something that was highly, it was a rhetoric of flow, because she had to, in a sense, impart that sense of flow through the idea of, an ecstasy as flow in rhetorical language. So she was, first and foremost, a writer, really. Of course, she was a writer. And so I think that was my introduction to her, really, as a kind of a text and a writer, rather than as a woman, but as a woman writer. And also, just to say very briefly, I had the extraordinary experience of sitting with one of her books in El Escorial, and which was given to me to film, and it's in my film. And one of the extraordinary things was to look at the annotations on the margins of Gracian and others. I think it was, they gave me one of the interior castles, and there's the notes. It's all redacted. So although so there's these two things going on. She was policed, and redacted and edited by the authority. But on the other hand, she knew how to negotiate her own voice, to kind of ensure her own voice was heard, using, rhetorical and literary devices.
But in a way, we have very different texts that she wrote. So she would be writing her life for the Inquisition, the interior castles for the nuns. So there was a different sort of audience she was writing to. So I think that would obviously, have another sort of way of writing or speaking. I mean, as far as I know, the interior castle was written very quickly, and at the end of her life, right? So what? And this sort of this diminishing of the self is something that is, you can see throughout, in many mystics, I think, except for Adovich, or there are just very few who were, very confident and feeling very beautiful and wonderful. But the rest of them, they would always sort of move into this. So it was almost something that was not new in Teresa. That that they would always withdraw with themselves, right? You've gone deep into Teresa of Avila and also Catherine of Siena as another mystic.
Yeah, and they both do that same, there is that similar trope of sort of self. The Alison Weber talks about it as a rhetoric of humility, and I think sort of argues that Teresa is, at least in the Spanish tradition, the first one not to just put a nice chunk of a paragraph at the beginning of your book talking about how terrible a person you are, and then to continue the rest of the book as normal, whereas Teresa is every paragraph, there's something about how terrible a little worm I am, and it becomes, at least for me, it's quite comic. It's sort of how, you were obviously, as Nina said, have a very clear sense of yourself, who you are, the power you have, and the drive you have towards, setting up your own little world with all of your followers. It's sort of funny in my mind that the male clerics and overseers ever took that seriously. It's not funny because it shows the level of rooted misogyny within the church at that time, but it's sort of very hard to take seriously. And Catherine of Siena has a very similar sort of feeling to me at times. There's a bit more guts in terms of when she writes her dialogue, and she literally writes as a soul and she writes as God. So she writes as God speaking, which is quite bold considering. And there's an interesting parallel there for me between Teresa and Catherine, or there's loads of interesting parallels for me between the two of them, but one of them is this sense of self-detachment from the self doing the writing. So Teresa quite often will be writing from a state not of union, but she is writing from quite far down the mystical path. So she has, by the time she starts writing, she has already begun to have some unitive experiences with God. She's begun to be sort of transformed at different levels. And she often talks about herself in the third person and says, oh, I know of someone who this happened to, and it's her. Everyone knows it's her. There's little notes in the margin that said whether confessors know it's her, which I sort of take to mean that she's indicating she's no longer that same self that had those experiences. She's much further down the path towards God than she was. And Catherine does something similar when she sort of, in writing the dialogue, she writes as a sort of anonymous soul. We know it's her. It's based on her experience. But she doesn't say, oh, I know this happened to me, this happened, blah, 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 blah. Instead, it's a sort of anonymized soul and God, so she can assume both positions, but also neither position. And that's sort of, I don't know, there's something very interesting for me in that sense of pushing, detaching themselves from the soul that is undergoing something that also allows you to then speak as the other or as God.
You speak to Teresa in the first person, and you speak to her as who do you speak to when you speak to?
So I used to only speak to Teresa, and about 2-3 years ago, I talked to Catherine, but I talked to them I talked to them in the first person. I do pray to them, even though I'm not Christian, I don't believe in God, but I believe in them. But I believe in them as a sort of like, I think Teresa still has a bit of a bigger presence because I've worked with her for like 10 years now. But Catherine's sort of wheedling her way in quite nicely. But I talk to them as a you plural, but they're kind of in one bubble, but the way I would start my prayer is to Teresa, although now Catherine is sort of subsumed under the Teresa bubble, I think, rather than a general mystic, because I'm not happy with the idea of a general mystic.
And you speak to them in words, or do you practice? Or through your art? Do you speak to them through language?
I normally speak to them in words. I whisper under my breath or in my head. But I've also done a practice for my PhD. The way I read Teresa's text, the methodology I developed, was through a sort of imitation of her reading practice, combined with like a sort of formulation of Lectio Divina from medieval monastic practices, so reading, meditation, prayer, and contemplation, which involved drawing, or writing them out, drawing sort of very intense attention to the text and the imagery within them. So I don't think of everything I make as praying, and it normally involves a lot of words and a lot of talking.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned somewhere, I read it in some of your, you mentioned dialogism or dialogue, so that comes obviously from Bakhtin and Kristeva and the intertextuality, so how you come and live in a text. The text is is what it's its context, but also the context of the reader. So it's sort of appropriated by different sort of agents. Well, agents, maybe not the word, but when you mention that as that dialogue, what can you explain that to us?
Yes, on a really basic level, Teresa talks about prayer as speaking alone with he who we know loves us and on whose nature we must attend, or something to those words. And Bernard McGinn has translated that passage as being conversation with friends, which I really like. And it's also the name of a Sally Rooney novel, which is quite a nice parallel. The way I tend to work is very dialogical, thinking about talking, or sort of dialogical, although now it's kind of a trialogue because of a sort of love triangle with me, Catherine, and Teresa. But they don't ever yet speak back to me, or not really with words. Not in a sort of, in the sense that they talk about God speaking to them.